Hi and welcome back to a special episode of the Gather podcast. So special we've actually splashed out on a studio today. So my name's Will Doyle. I'm the founder and CEO of Gather, formerly Rail Diary. In a past life, I was a chartered quantity surveyor building construction projects here in the UK and in Southeast Asia. One of my common challenges is around how we manage the contracts, how we deal with our supply chain and with our client as a contractor. Today, I'm joined by two experts in this field, specifically in NEC. First, we've got Nick Woodrow. Nick Woodrow is Operations Director at Gather, previously a civil engineer before working at CMAR together with our second guest, Ben Walker. Ben founded CMAR and a contract management system you're probably all familiar with. Prior to that, Ben started working with the NEC in 2008 as a trainer, assessor, and more recently as a drafter. Today, I'm going to be talking through with Ben and Nick how to best use site records to get the most out of your NEC contract. I'd like you to introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you got into this role with the NEC and with CMAR.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, and great to be here. So my background, I started CMAR from a real pain, as sometimes the good ideas do begin, and I know you've first-hand experience of that. So I've been site-based for several years and really loved NEC. I've always thought it's a great contract and it's very focused in good project management practices. It turns out that needs a lot of administration, and so finding myself in a site hut Saturdays and Sundays doing admin didn't seem very satisfactory, and I thought there might be a better way of approaching it. One example springs to mind is looking through the window of one of the site offices. I could see the clipboard hanging up with the next available early warning number on it. I just couldn't see it close enough to actually see what the number would be, so I couldn't send a notification. So real first-hand frustrations that used to prevent sort of slick admin. So in setting CMAR up and starting to prototype it and pilot it, I started to realise how much I needed to really understand the fundamentals of NEC and how they work. So training seemed like a good thing to get involved with, and having spoken to thousands of delegates over the years and listening to their practical challenges really starts to help you understand how you might solve some of those pain points between the theory and philosophy and actually doing things in practice. And that kind of led into the examining you mentioned, and then the drafting, which was really good fun as well. I've still got a passion for making NEC work in practice. Excellent.
Okay, well, let's get straight into our first question. So, the kind of what you learn on your first day on any construction project feels like records. That's the old adage, isn't it? So, why are site records important for construction projects, and why are they important for NEC?
They're incredibly important for all projects, aren't they? Not just NEC contracts. And I think historically they would be used for health and safety records, for audit trails, for quality assurance, engineering assurance. I know we're going to talk today more about the sort of commercial assurance use of records. But I know from my time working on site as a project engineer, I would have a A4 desk diary to record exactly what's happened on every shift, because that's the way that engineers and QSs have been trained, because those records are so important for all those elements. What should be in your experience, Ben, in relation to NEC?
I can become quite attached to my carbon triplicate A4 pad. I'm not, so the same really. And I think I'd agree with you. I don't think there's any specific thing that makes NEC sort of more deserving of good record keeping. But certainly we can explore where NEC perhaps either explicitly requires it or relies upon good, robust record keeping. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what does the contracts, and when we talk about the contract here, we mean the NEC contract, what does the NEC contract say specifically about site records?
I don't think it explicitly distinguishes site records from any other record. It does on occasions refer to specific records, for instance, weather data, and weather records, weather measurements, and that's in one of the compensation events, number 13, I think, in the core clauses. Then there's more broadly records around defined cost that the contractor must keep. There's no doubt records relating to test inspection under clause 4 or the 40 series of clauses. There's more generally that obligation to keep records and keep them organised in a useful way, perhaps, will enable us to walk through the NEC procedures effectively and bring each other along, right? So we're not surprising each other, and hopefully we've got a common set of records that we both recognise as the single truth.
As a stimulus for good project management, which is a lot of what the processes in the contract have been written to provide, in certain areas it's quite prescriptive about what needs to be done. So in program, in section 3, it's quite prescriptive about the level of detail needs to be provided in a program for acceptance, submitting for acceptance. But there isn't any detail around the collection of more wider site records in general. Is there a specific reason for that, or is that an observation that's maybe unfounded?
I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I think you're right. So in the programming clauses, there's under time, there's a fairly extensive list of bullet points, and the important thing to remember there, of course, is that I think it's the last bullet point says, and anything the scope requires, and we're still talking about what we must capture or what we must achieve in that document, in that tool, and I think when we start getting into scope, it's natural for people to start moving into how we do that. So it might be, and we would like it in a certain format, or kept in a certain way. And so a massive point, actually, make sure you read the scope. I can remember in NEC 3, there were 28 touch points between the scope and the conditions. I think there's more sort of somewhere in the mid-30s of places in the contract where the conditions talk about the scope and rely on statements in that. So this is a really important area. Make sure you read the scope, and if you're drafting scope, make sure you're putting those extra requirements in there. But to your point about it being perhaps weaker in other areas, I'm not sure that's true. So although the definition of defined cost is fairly brief, it does point you to, certainly when you get into the price for work done to date, it points you in the direction of the scheduler cost components, or the short scheduler cost components if you're on one of the priced options. And in there is an extensive list of tests which you have to satisfy. And again, these are what it is rather than how to capture it. But I think that's intentional. I think certainly, pretty much everything I do from a business point of view, I try and think about why, the how, and the what. And if we were to map that to NEC, I suppose you could say the conditions of contract, the clauses of the contract very much tell you what you must achieve and what's expected. The why is, I think, in the guidance notes. So there's a good philosophy and an explanation as to how the drafters are approaching these clauses in a narrative, perhaps in volume 4, and in volume 2 there's some good material there to explain how it might be used in use. But really, guidance is about why we're doing something. The contract is setting out the what. The how is kind of left to the user.
To what extent would you think that it is beneficial when that can be set out in the scope to a certain degree, so you get some level of consistency, for instance, in getting site records with a certain level of detail? You'd expect to see that as part of the scope to define what the client wants to receive, I think, from site in those records? Yeah, sure.
I think if there's a range of possibilities, and some might be better than others, or an expectation might be clearer in some areas, then yes, saying what you want in the scope is a good move. I think, to explain perhaps why the contract doesn't do that briefly, my understanding would be, well, if that was explicit in the contract, then it would perhaps only be valid for a narrow type of works or services. You'd have to make an assumption about what was appropriate and what was applicable for a given environment or given project. So take an example, the core clause test for open market rates, competitively tendered prices, that would be difficult to prescribe how you achieve that. If you're building an extension on your house, you might be comfortable with a couple of conversations over the phone with different plant material providers. If you were building a multi-million-pound infrastructure project, then you would need a fair bit more than that. So I think you're right, that kind of how lives more in the scope, and an ongoing conversation between the parties. I mean, the best projects will be run, these sorts of things won't be decided all up front, and they won't happen just in the correspondence required in the contract. They'll happen in a collaborative conversation that seeks to get closer to agreement with a small a on a range of issues, and records is one of them.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because actually agreeing what you provide, when you provide it, and to what detail is probably a good thing to do before you start, especially if it's not actually prescribed in the scope.
Yeah.
Saying, I'm going to give you these records, and I'm going to give you them at these timescales every day, every week.
Yeah, and the project manager can always instruct a change to the scope to introduce a new requirement if the parties really can't agree on how to administer things and present things.
Yeah, because it's not something that's set out in, say, contract data, like you're going to get a program at these intervals. I want them at these intervals. It's not like so something to agree on maybe before you start work is.
Yeah, well, contract data will set an
records.
interval for the minimum interval for program submissions. But yes, and of course, we talked about program a fair bit. The other thing that listening to Glenn Hyde and others on program, it's a pragmatic. Even the presentation of it's got to be pragmatic to a degree. You won't have full high granularity on absolutely everything on day one, and I've always thought of it as being a bit of a bow wave that moves a couple of months in front of you, where you turn up the resolution and the details. And certainly around early warnings and compensation events perhaps that you're aware of, you might turn up the vigilance on your record keeping, so that you've got the tools to do those assessments, and that bow wave perhaps serves that next assessment for the application for payment, or the next payment assessment.
That makes a lot of sense. In terms of the how, do you think we'll ever get to that point where we're prescribing it, or is there a risk to kind of to ruin something quite good if we start to do too much on the how?
I think there's always that risk. I don't think the drafters should do much more. I think the contract it's probably got it about right. Although community feedback's always useful. I think it's over to the rich community of NEC practitioners, the fantastic tools and systems that spring up. We mentioned a few already, and let them help us configure the contracts. And in the same way that we're cautious with clients, we as clients, we're told not to over specify the how, because by doing so you start to stifle innovation and shut down opportunities that you might not have unlocked through future collaboration. So be careful of that. In my training, I always used to give the example of, if you want a chocolate cake, you specify a chocolate cake, constrain in terms of, I don't want nuts in it. But you wouldn't go so far if Gordon Ramsay was your contractor to tell him what temperature to set the oven. Yes, so
no, you wouldn't.
Leave the how at large a little bit, opens up some more possibilities and some opportunities for innovation and collaboration with the supply chain.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so the next kind of key question for me then is how does our records affect how we administer the contracts? So how are site records affecting those different functions within the typical contracting arrangement?
And maybe we can break this down into
it's a big area, isn't it?
Payment, which is obviously one area that's very important to have good site records, and the administration of change. And then maybe there's a third area around program and long-term learning and the use of that data to support better contract management going forward. Should we start with payment?
Yeah, let's start with how it affects payment. How do site records affect payment?
Okay, well, payment in NEC for ECC, engineering construction contract, there's 6 main options. If we perhaps deal with the priced ones versus the cost ones, and so from a payment point of view, if we look at the price for work done to date for each of those in turn, so for option A, which is a priced contract with an activity schedule, the payment, if you like, is rooted in the prices on the schedule. So if we're assuming we're going to leave compensation events or other methods of change to one side for a minute, just think purely about payment. I guess it's still important to record that the work and the activity is done, and that it's free of any defects that might stop it being used or progressing on to the next one. So from that point of view, maybe it's fairly limited, but all records are good records.
It would smooth the process of agreeing that, and because activity, correct me if I'm wrong, needs to be 100% complete to get paid any of that activity.
Yeah.
So it would smooth that process to say this is complete and free of defects to get paid.
Sure. And hopefully the resolution of the program should have synergy with the activity schedule. You should be able to look out the window ideally and see it's done, and it shouldn't be too challenging, which is why that mechanism's good. It's got its benefits. For B, option B, price contract with bill of quantities. Obviously, the nature of it suggests we've got quantities, so we've got rates for things, and so the records would be useful in accordance with the method of measurement in terms of observing what's been done. Now, some of those things might be repetitive and therefore not something we need records for necessarily. It might come directly from a payroll tool, perhaps, if we're talking about the salaries of certain people. But a lot of it won't be. A lot of it will be through observation on site, and it might not just be quantities of materials. Of course, it could be quantities of or hours of equipment that are used in the site. And so I think from an option B point of view, there's records are useful, even from a payment point of view, before we think about compensation events.
And is that where resource allocation be useful too, to match up to that bill in terms of payment?
Yeah, and I guess this is where we were saying before we started the podcast about some of the probably come on to that later perhaps where we look at what's the benefits of digitizing it, because there's a lot from that single set of data. There's actually a lot of perspectives that we might want to orientate that through and present it in different ways for different purposes. So certainly indexation or tagging against the activity that work relates to, ideally right up to the BIM model, and then in the other direction, what commercial events and matters does it relate to? I think that takes record keeping as an activity. It takes its benefits beyond just being evidential. It then starts to make it really useful from a prospective thing. I think we probably cover that in
let's get
question.
Into that further on. But in terms of the cost base,
the cost ones, So the other options, define cost, as we mentioned earlier, has an extensive set of tests against it. Then there's a lot of quantum in it. So we're measuring directly in accordance with the schedule cost components. How many of things we're using? How many of I can use the word things? That's in NEC. It is things as a word. Trying to get
a defined term.
Trying to get no, it's not defined. It's not got capital T. But so whatever things or we're measuring in terms of how many we've used or how many hours. Site records can't hurt, can they? And I know that over time we'll get more telemetry around things like how long is a piece of equipment, not plant equipment with a capital E, running. Then maybe some of that can be automated, but it still needs pulling together. It still needs indexing against what work activity perhaps it relates to, and also again the ability to tag it against a commercial event if one does arise.
So in assessing the price for work done to date in what would be described as the cost reimbursable options, you've got defined costs, which is made up of the schedule of cost components.
Yeah.
And I think almost all of those are probably going to work better if you've got some good records behind them, the subcontracted work.
Absolutely.
The people costs, the activities. And
ideally you'd structure your record sheet, you configure it so it speaks to those components as identified in the schedule, so that you're not talking about plant, labour and materials, but you're actually talking about, however you've...
And you can aggregate that data from all of your collective records into that one application.
Yeah, which starts to be where you perhaps... I know you have a later question on how does digitisation improve that, and it takes it way beyond just the evidential. But I think the other point to make actually on whilst we're just talking about costs briefly is we talk about establishing something as defined cost. Once it is, of course, we need to then establish whether it is or is not a disallowed cost. So, and there's a few interesting tests on that. Nick, I think you've got a contract to hand, so we're not guessing. But do you want to have a look so we're not guessing? A big fan of having the contract on the desk rather than in the drawer. So all those listeners who know the NEC philosophy will have theirs on the table, I'm sure, to have a quick look at. I think it's in any of the price main options. Sorry, in any of the cost-based main options. So CDE, there'll be the definition of disallowed cost, and in there we talk about. I think the first bullet is not justified by the contractor's accounts and records. So what better way?
You could potentially argue that the site records may be even more important for dealing with this element of disallowed cost as they are for just assessing the total amount of the defined cost, because you're measuring that on the difference between the last application and this application, and you've probably got a recurring way of doing that that's starting to work for you.
Yeah, and that's if it's
how we capture these disallowed costs now is really important.
Yeah, and that's as if it's got as far as being in this formal submission of the application for payment. I mean, if teams are collaborating and putting the application to payment together in the same way that they might be collaborating on forming the next program revision, then hopefully, really, the contract bit is a formality.
It's an admin process.
We shouldn't find hundreds of compensation event quotations that need to be struck out, or hundreds of applications for payment that are radically different from the assessment that then follows. But then in the I think it's the sort of 6th and 7th bullet points of that same definition, we talk about actually one of the rare occasions where NEC introduces some subjectivity. It talks about is it reasonable wastage?
So for plant and materials not used to provide the works. In parenthesis, after allowing for reasonable wastage.
Yeah.
And then in relation to the resources, after allowing for reasonable availability and utilisation. So,
which again could be people or equipment. And in the case of equipment, one such test might be, and it is subjective. Should we have demobilised that crane over the weekend and brought it back to site, or was it appropriate to leave it there, not being utilised, but And actually, if we've got good records, it should be a calculation, right?
I would like to think that good records would render the bit that's in brackets here that introduces some subjectivity, diminishing it to the point where hopefully this is an objective assessment, that you remove that subjectivity from these assessments. In fact, every single bullet point here, when I read down them, not justified by the contractor's accounts of records, I don't read them all, shouldn't have been paid to a subcontractor. Every one of them would benefit from having exceptional records. And if you're a contractor, I would argue that's a very important thing to do, so that you try and mitigate and just smooth this process over.
Yeah, and you've made me think about something else. I mean, and let's be really clear, wouldn't it be great if it was one set?
As opposed to what double
opposed
handling.
to what I've perhaps been used to in practice in the past, where I'd go out with my triplicate pad and someone else would have another triplicate pad,
and then the supplier would have their own,
and then the supplier, the subcontractor
across the supply chain, as Mr. Patterson would say,
across the supply chain, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, it strikes me that a single source of truth on this, that we can agree with a small a as we go. It makes sense, doesn't it? Why would we do anything else?
That's what we're doing in practice. But yeah, so let's hope we can change that. So we've covered payment. How about compensation events?
So for compensation events, again, the default position is to use defined cost, and this is true even in the priced, even in the priced payment mechanisms. In A and B, we use the short scheduler cost components, and much of what we've just explained in terms of assessing defined cost or establishing defined cost for the assessment of payment is true in assessing compensation events. I would like to sort of hijack the podcast just for a second to get on my soapbox about something, which is clause 63.1.
Feel free.
This is still, thank you. This is still, I was going to, so I guess you could edit it out, but hopefully you won't.
It's fine, go for it.
I still think people fall into the trap of not reading this and understanding it. There's still pockets of people who read that and think what clause 63.1 means is to take the kind of forecast defined cost of the new work not yet done in the compensation event and compare that cost with the price that's in the activity schedule or the sum of the items.
Do you mean the interplay between 63.1 that says that we'll assess the change of the prices, the effect of the compensation event upon defined cost, and the following clause that says we can agree it against?
No, you don't need to get to the following clause. No, I think it's 63.1
all within that same
itself
clause
is misunderstood. So, and what it really is saying is you need to almost do a mini estimating piece if it's prospective, which most of them are. I guess in weather events and physical conditions, for example, you might have a bit of retrospective assessment where you take the costs that would have actually happened, and you do an assessment on that, and then you do an assessment of ideally a forecast, but sometimes retrospective, on what that cost was with the compensation event. So you're doing a with and without, or without, or a with and but for.
That's the same across all the payment options, because it's exactly the same clause, because it's in the core clause of the contract.
And that's why.
So the importance of those site records for either A, B, C, D, E, or even F.
And I think you can go a step further, and maybe just touch on this briefly. I think then that really good records, they have two roles. So the first one is in isolation, you pull a record back to as a form of evidence to justify an account and record. But I think actually if we digitally capture them, particularly if we link them to a tool like CMAR or an asset management platform, we can start to do clever things. We can start to inform and perhaps agree with a small a rates of productivity that help us perform prospective assessments and forecasts. So in a way, we're taking the empirical contemporary adjacent activity and saying, well, that was a productivity, that week, where it's the same week, it's a very similar activity. So it gives us that productivity bit that quite often is a source of discussion, together with the rates and percentages and contract data. We can start to get quite close to.
And this feeds into that third area of benefit and application of the contract.
Yeah.
We've got these elements of long-term learning that we can use to help us assess.
Yep. Completely.
As we go through a long project, say HS2 is like, it could be 15 years long, and in year 6 we could be doing a lot better assessments than year 3 because we've captured all these productivity metrics. And we've got this knowledge about what's happened, so it's much easier for us to forecast what might happen in the future in the same conditions.
And the same for the program. It's got to be realistic. So if we've got realistic productivity, which can be unlocked through scrutinising a collection of an aggregate of records rather than just looking at individual ones, then that can inform a program revision so it becomes more realistic because we've got realistic run rates in there. And don't forget, when you submit a compensation event, back to the question, we need to update the program where it's got an impact on remaining activities. So it's all kind of related. That's just slightly different to your other point. What you said, does that kind of bleed into the next clause? The next clause.
Well, I've got another observation on that next clause as well, but you go on and then I'll come back to it.
Well, that's slightly different. So that is more about the project manager and the contractor having a pragmatic view that, in their opinion, and only through agreement, otherwise the default is defined cost, as we just discussed, then they might use rates and prices in the contract to come up with a basis of assessing a compensation event.
I would. My feeling is in the industry that, especially where fixed price contracts are being used, that people will move straight to 63.2 on an assumption that they'll just go to either the rate, the bill, an agreed bill in option B or in option A. Right, we've got the same activity, and they'll just go straight to it because that was how the job was priced, especially maybe on the client side. But that's not the intention of these clauses, is it? But I think that's maybe the interpretation by some people, going back to your point about confusion.
It depends what it is. I mean, if we're talking about one of the questions, I seem to remember one of the case studies from training courses I did a long time ago, something about cherry trees. If we're planting cherry trees and a specification, a change to the what was works information in NEC 3 comes down and specifies a slightly different species of cherry tree, we're probably not going to get too excited about doing a full-blown time and motion study on looking at the defined cost. It might be that the cost of doing that is more than just agreeing.
It's a similar size and shape.
So this gives the project manager and the contractor acting appropriately for their, to come up with something that's sensible. And so, I think it's a really useful, really useful provision, and it absolutely should be there. But each of those, so both the contractor and the project manager, have in the back of their mind got this ability to say, well, actually, I think there was a loss leader perhaps in the contract, or we were losing money hand over fist, and therefore we don't want to compound that problem. We'll go to defined cost.
Yeah, my experience from projects that we've been involved with recently is people reverting to rates. It's almost the easy option because they don't have the time or the detail to be able to do that actual assessment. They don't have the detailed records, so they're just reverting back to the rates, regardless if it's a loss leader or not, and it's actually causing quite a few problems, usually for the supplier.
Well, the problems aren't imposed, are they? Because it's only by agreement. And I think the second thing to say is, if you are in an option A or B, certainly an option A contract, you might simply have not set up the mechanisms and the machinery in terms of people and what have you to have extensive capture of defined cost, because you don't do it for payment. So, and indeed the short schedule, for equipment, for example, it points to a published list with a percentage adjustment in contract data rather than going back to first principles. So I think horses for courses. And
absolutely.
I think in my personal experience, a bit like with disallowed costs, where you're receiving or you're contributing to having a really clear set of single records that you've all agreed is what has happened on site, then it just smooths out any of these processes and just makes them quicker to administer.
Yeah, and ideally, if you've established the open market competitively tendered rate for a 30-ton excavator and nothing too much has changed in the last few months, then if that's what you use for defined cost, in previous assessment, then you've got a starting point, haven't you, for the next one? And so I think in terms of C, D, and E, of course, records play a big role in compensation events. They do in A and B as well. And for all payment mechanisms, robust records of defined cost, they can't hurt, can they?
You could argue from a contractor's perspective, you could make the argument that they're more important on the fixed price contracts, so they can do cost value reconciliation and understand exactly where they're at, than on the cost reimbursable ones, where that's being tracked on a monthly basis naturally through the application for payment and assessment. The target might be adjusted, or the pain gain share might be being eroded or increased.
You could.
On the fixed price, you could have a problem that goes on that you don't recognise if you're not capturing those productivity metrics.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that goes back to the point about there perhaps just being less set up and machinery around looking closely at what's happening in terms of open cost accounting, which you would have if you were on a cost contract, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, that's quite a good discussion. So I'm just going to get into it really. The next point, and I've got a very strong opinion on this for obvious reasons, is what are best practices in the industry for capturing records? I set up Gather, formerly Rail Diary, because of a personal pain. I was sick and tired of dealing with horrible paper records that were done on triplicate pads. I couldn't read them. They weren't available when I needed that information. They were everywhere. I famously tell a story that records were in dusty lever arch files. They were stuffed down the front of people's vans. They're even in a skip because we closed down the project office and someone didn't think they were important anymore. So records are important. We all get that. We've just described why they're important for payment, for conversation events, and a whole host of other reasons. But what do we believe as kind of people within this industry is best practice? What should we view that as?
Should we just reflect a bit more on what's actually happening, or we understand to be happening,
of course,
before we move on to that? Because I think you've touched on one area of it. But I mean, I started on site nearly 25 years ago, and I think that most of the practices happening now are identical, or almost identical to then. You know, we've got first-hand anecdotal evidence, or we've heard this evidence of people having bin bags of allocation sheets from suppliers under their desk that they're then having to wade through and transpose into a spreadsheet.
I think you're right, and I think it's easy to mistake digitization as being putting it in a spreadsheet. It reminds me, you used to criticize me. I used to, Nick, so you really need to digitize your note taking in meetings. So I would write my minutes in a pad and then take a digital picture of it.
Just scan the notes.
which you suggested
it's
might not be
slightly better than paper, isn't it? And
well,
come up with the right word
you've
for
got to
that.
do it in the right way, haven't you? So when I started Rail Diary, as it was,
Yeah.
and I met Paul, who's our CTO and ran a digital agency called Gather Digital at the time, the first thing I learned was the best way to enter data is not in a table. Like, that's not how you enter data. That's how you interpret it or read it. But when you're asking someone to capture data on site, it's not just about going take this fancy spreadsheet that QS has built and put it on an iPad or put on a tablet. It's about giving it structured workflow and making it easy for that person in orange in the pouring rain to capture that data correctly. So yeah, the digitization is not just making it electronic, to use your example from Nick's
also
notes.
think
Yeah,
we
it's
need
got to
to-
be digital, but also, sorry, Nick.
I was only going to say that we need to be very careful about throwing stones and preaching about what's not happening. You know, saying that things are done this way and they have been for so many years. But part of the reason for that is that we do need to do what you're saying and make it really simple for people to then bring into their day job a process which is digitized, which does all the things that we want it to do, but it's simple. It's not disrupting what they're doing. It fits with the things that they've got to comply with, and we're not making their lives more difficult, because we've got less people now probably trying to deliver more construction work than we did 25 years ago, and we're asking more of them all the time.
You're right, and the catalyst for change isn't just having a good digital solution, right? That's
Agreed.
That's a requirement. But actually, you've got to unstick the current practice in a less painful way. So, you know, I think sometimes when you're rolling out a new IT product, you think, oh well, let's add up the training costs, let's add up the learning of that new system and its capital outlay or whatever. That's part of it, but there's a big bit of mobilization of actually demobilizing what's currently being done. And I think if you can do that in a way that doesn't overly disrupt or isn't too painful, and actually puts the delivery of the project and the customers at the end of that in front of mind, then you've got more of a roadmap to introducing digital.
Just on that, Ben, how did you do that, CMAR? How did you unstick that problem?
I think that's a good question. I think we did it in two ways. Firstly, we were always as good as paper.
Okay.
And tried very hard not to lose anything, because certain people still want to write. People still want to write margins. Yeah, no, I don't mean data. I mean the ability, the function. So, you know, if you're like me, you still want to write in the margins of your contracts, and so we made sure you could still annotate things and add notes and attachments or whatever else. And then I think you've got to add genuine value, and you've got to do it in a way that doesn't mean you have to throw everything out all at once. So make a first step and slowly grow into it. There's a great, I forgot what, I was watching a podcast, I can't remember what it was now, but it was a simple chart. It must apply to everything. The progress you make by making small changes every day, rather than waiting for something to be perfect.
Those marginal gains.
Marginal gains. Yeah.
And I think we always talked about trying to preserve there's benefits to paper systems.
Yeah,
We've been managing projects for 200 years this way. So everyone's processes are ingrained, and our
Yep.
way of understanding how we do work is ingrained in those paper processes. So I think with CMAR and other good systems that I've seen that do similar work is that you're preserving the benefits of paper. You're creating digital folder structures so that it's familiar to people. So you're not just harnessing the latest crazy bit of tech and saying, right, we're going to do it now with goggles on, and you're trying to create a world that feels familiar, but just move it slowly forward in the right direction in terms of then collaboratively having access to that data, having it in real time,
and keep it as less as possible. So unfussy, simple, easy to use. All these things are crucial to if we're going to have a catalyst to changing this. But just to draw out the really big points here, I think what would be best practice, capturing those records as a single truth.
Okay.
I think making sure that if you've got six to eight, 1, 2, well, it'd be more than 1 minute, but 2 to 10 organisations in the supply chain.
So all parties to the contract say that's what happened on site.
Let's try and have a single truth for the records.
Yep.
So I think that's really important.
Single source of truth. Okay.
Yeah, I think configuring those records so that they meet the expectation and they're usable in a valuable way to each of those parties, and also having ways of presenting them or tagging them or flagging them against the different events and works activities, again speaks to that second point. And then thirdly, configuring them in a way that actually talks to the records and how they're used. So, let's not call it labour plant material if we're using an NEC contract.
No, we need to look at that.
It's good feedback, isn't it? Because traditionally, as a QS, I call it labour plant materials, but that's not what the contract says.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. But that's not what it says. And when we were preparing for this, I learned a few things about equipment and plant and how it's different. But yeah, we need to capture one source of the truth. We need to make sure it's in a usable format. We're capturing everything for everyone and not leaving out something that would be useful for another party. And then we are making it so it lines up with our contract.
The quote that your colleague Robert Gerard says is, we shouldn't be arguing about facts.
Yes.
And we'll steal that from him when we keep repeating it back to people, because we're feeling, in this day and age with the technology available to us, we shouldn't be arguing about facts. That should be a simple part of the process.
Yeah.
I think what we're guilty of in construction technology as a whole, and I was speaking to Jason Lancini, who's the CEO of Afex recently, and he was saying construction industry is guilty for making the person on site responsible for everything. We put so much pressure on that individual to capture all this information when really we want them to be delivering. So let's try and make it easy to capture those records and not this onerous task, and not just think about what's best for someone who needs a fancy chart or dashboard, and let's think about how we capture that data.
I think we cover this a bit when we come to talk about disputes, don't we, as well?
Yeah, so that's my next question. You've hit the nail on the head. So yeah, well, there'll be a lot of people who'll be watching this who are involved in disputes. So my good question for you, mainly yourself, Ben, is how does the NEC deal with disputes, and why are records important for that process?
So how does NEC deal with disputes? Well, there's a few dispute resolution options, but typically adjudication is the first port of call, which is a private affair before you go to tribunal if you decide that that's not enough, which could be litigation or arbitration. But an adjudicator is an expert appointed. Doesn't have to be a lawyer. Might be if the nature of the dispute is in quantum or engineering or whatever else, it would be perhaps an expert in the field.
Of course.
But before we get that far, if disputes typically are either about quantum or about point of principle or a mixture of the two, right? I mean, typically, I think that's a fair summary of them. And it strikes me that with really good records, we'd have fewer disputes, or certainly there would be less to debate in the quantum side. Not in every case, but you'd like to think that would hopefully avoid them, and those that were remaining simplify them a little bit, so perhaps they were more about points of principle. And I think, again, the ability to link site records to the activities of work and to the commercial events makes their recall, their presentation, their orientation for those different uses, whether it's a cost engineer or a QS or somebody looking at productivity when it comes to programming. I think the other thing with having good records is that we're less likely to get into dispute, because particularly if it's a single truth, because the teams, when putting their applications to payment together or their assessment of payment, when they're putting quotations together for compensation events, if they're dealing with a trusted source of truth, then they're able to collaborate more easily, and it becomes familiar. We trust that's something we just
You're
go
taking
to.
things off the table, aren't you?
You're taking more off the table. Yeah, you're with a small A. I said before, you're kind of agreeing big swathes of it, and then you've got more time then, right, to think about and more certainty to think about perhaps some points of principle.
I'd like to test this by getting some feedback, but I wonder how many times someone's gone to adjudication with a completely agreed set of site records, because my feeling is that probably never happens.
Yeah.
And that if you were in a place where you had you probably would have worked it out amongst yourselves, I suspect. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know.
It would be really good. Well,
whether any adjudication has a completely defined set of records that everyone agrees on.
Well, we could ask, you mentioned Robert Judd, I'm sure he would tell us how long he typically spends establishing the records on something. And I'd be interested to know how much that costs.
I was going to say the cost of it.
Because I bet that in aggregate is far more than it would be to implement something from the beginning that meant
that you both agreed had this. Yeah.
I mean, why would we do anything else?
Yeah. Prevention is better than cure, isn't it, really? We need to get ahead of it and not just wait for it to go wrong. Anything else you want to add onto that point, Nick, around dispute?
No, I think it goes back to the other point about having these site records just to smooth the process, to make the administration easier. I mean, I think it's very unlikely that adjudicators are being presented with an agreed set of records. If they are, then I'm sure their job's far easier to support people and get into an amicable outcome.
Yeah, and you just made me think about something else as well. We've got lots of proactive mechanisms in the contract. Early warning is the obvious one, to actually head off some of those problems. And if you've got good records, good productivity, run rates, things like that at your fingertips, lessons learned, probably more from the big data rather than one record against one item, then you're even better armed to maybe come up with a solution, agree an action to head off an issue under the early warning meetings mechanism. In the same way that I'd hope you'd take a contemporary program to an early warning meeting, so that you could really see how the different activities interplayed and where the opportunities might be to save a bit of time or switch things up. So it just becomes another tool then, doesn't it?
Nick, you got anything else to add on this point?
I think we can, there's an interesting area to ask you, Ben, at the other end of the spectrum to disputes, is how do you see, collecting good site records contributing to the effective, meeting the obligations of Clause 10, being able to meet those?
Okay, well, in NEC 4, Clause 10 is now split into 10.1 and 10.2. So 10.1 is about doing as stated in the contract. I guess for all the reasons we've discussed, it will make that smoother, and therefore perhaps if something is easier to do, it's more likely to be done. So there's that. In 10.2, mutual trust and cooperation. Well, I guess in setting the culture, the ethos around that, achieving that, trust is perhaps grown from behaviours, among other things. And there's an excellent podcast on the NEC Spotlight
it is brilliant
app, which
Listen
will perhaps put a link in on the kind of behaviours and unpacking what trust is. So we'll put a link to that. But in demonstrating that trust, I guess it's a bit like risk, isn't it? If we can just avoid the risk altogether, then that's better than attempting to mitigate it. And if we've got really good records that we've both signed up to as a single truth, then maybe we don't have to actually dabble in too much trust in that, because it's inherent in how we've established ourselves. And that goes for writing the appropriate things that meet our expectations in the
So
scope
you're
as well.
suggesting if they are reliable and they are the facts, then I don't have to trust you when you tell me that X happened, because we both agreed that those are the facts.
Yeah,
then we can avoid having to...
Yeah, it's sort of built in, isn't it? So we trust in the solution. We trust that the solution's operated well, and it's got integrity to it, it's robust, and in a way that makes us both more comfortable. And then what were the three things in that podcast? Capability,
reliability,
and intimacy. So go and watch that podcast, it's brilliant. But I think having good records and something that we both agree on and we're in the groove with will make trust a little easier to come.
You're reliable.
you're
partner, aren't
reliable.
you? A reliable stakeholder. If you're doing consistently providing that information, I think that makes you feel reliable and therefore is going to contribute to a better culture.
I also think, perhaps not quite in the question, but I also think it's there's a lot of accessibility benefits as well. We all work from home now. We tend to fit around our private lives a lot more than we used to, and so having immediate access to a set of records. One of the clauses for defined cost is that a contractor makes available to the project manager records of defined cost for inspection during working hours. I mean, we can, if we do it properly and in the way we're suggesting, well, then it will always be available. So
organisations have much thinner management teams now, so the chances, even if you wanted to go on site once a week, especially in some assets where they're under possession, so it's very difficult for you to get amongst them where the work is, having access to contemporary records that are of high quality, it's going to make your job much easier, isn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely. I think that probably leads me very nicely onto my next question around digital tools. We've all seen the amazing impacts that CMAR has had on how people manage NEC contracts. Thinking about site records, and obviously I've got a huge interest in this. How can we leverage digital technology to have that same positive impact on NEC contracts and site records?
Well, how? I think we go back to that understanding the catalyst and being mindful that a good solution isn't the whole of the answer. We need to think about how we unstick people from their current practices without too much pain.
Absolutely.
So there's that. But in terms of why is it important to do it, and what the role digital has in it, I think it's really far-reaching. And I'm not going to attempt to talk about AI and machine learning and things like that. So before we even get that far, probably three things spring to mind, whether you're a client or a contractor. I think firstly, it takes the role of records, so the digitization of them takes the role of records beyond just the point evidential. So taking a record and justifying it as an accountant record. I think it goes way beyond that, because in aggregate, this is a powerful productivity analysis tool. It's enables us to perhaps more easily achieve some of the philosophy of NEC around forecasting and prospective assessments. So I think there's a really big bit there, and lessons learned, and estimators. It will help estimators and scheduling.
Your first point there reminds me of what we used to talk about at CMAR, which was that we were managing events, not documents. So traditionally, the management of the contract was about exchanging documents, and you were managing documents, and we're like, well, what you're actually doing is trying to manage these events, and documents are an output, they're a reporting function.
Right.
But it's about the event, and I think we need to probably move the industry slowly forward to see that this data that we're getting back from site is not about a single site diary. It's about getting data in these chunks that relate to parts of the contract, and then using them in workflow and reporting for where their benefits are, and not just having this audit page that goes in a lever arch file and then collects dust until we have our big bun
and
fight.
It's got such limited use, and all that effort in recording it isn't being leveraged on a day-to-day basis. It's there in case we might want to look at that in isolation, and it's a real lost opportunity. You remind me actually of something that the great late Dr. Martin Barnes said at a conference, which is project management is about influencing what hasn't yet happened. Everything else is just administration. So are we administering the records for the sake of doing records in case we have a problem? How miserable is that? How about we capture them all in a really good way and then actually feed that back into our project management processes for the better?
Going back for the very start of the conversation about why it's always been done, I think for a lot of those reasons it's been done, for either health and safety, for quality assurance, for engineering assurance, it's been very important to have a robust audit trail. That shows we built this thing safely, we built it to the required quality and specification, and you've got that. But that has a limited value, doesn't it?
But heat map back to a BIM model or an asset management tool or a commercial tool, then you can really leverage some lessons learned. And 1 + 1 is not 2. And so I think that would be one of my other sort of top 3 things. So we've got the elevation of it beyond just the evidential record into something that's prospectively useful. We've got the integration with other data from other sources that is becoming absolutely day-to-day what people do now. So integrating that data with things like contract management tools, asset management tools. And then secondly, I think just from convenience, and we said that might speak to acting as stated in the contract, just having that at your fingertips, but also being able to orientate it. So one data set orientated many ways. So here's the report that's useful to the cost controller. Here's the report that's useful to the QS. Here's the report that's useful to the inspector. So who's looking after the shift patterns. So I think here's one for handover. I think there's so many different ways, and we can leverage that digitally, can't we?
Massively. I think at the moment, those individual paper records on triplicate pads are individual bits of a jigsaw, aren't they? And when you use a digital tool, you can put them all together, and that same bit of data can be used in 5, 6, 7 ways for the different parties within your project management organization. So we can use that data proactively for all those different functions rather than reactively, as Nick alluded to, when the inevitable bun fight happens at the end of a project, which is what it was traditionally used for. So it's about moving away from that.
I heard recently a really good little saying, something along the lines of, by digitizing it, you're preparing to answer questions you haven't thought of yet. And
well, that's exactly what I was just thinking of, because when we started looking at reports in CMAR from the data that we were capturing, there was a particularly large client who owned a huge asset in the aviation industry. They didn't have any insight into the shape of how many compensation events and the value of them in different chunks. So how many conversations do I get across my whole portfolio that are between this amount and this amount? So where was the level of effort required to manage the contract for their teams? Because obviously they had a finite resource to manage the contract. And through the insights they could gain from a platform where you're capturing every single compensation event and the quantum of it, you can say, well, actually, I need the team to go into this area because we've got, we can let the project managers look after this, because the total impact of all these small compensation events, the actual aggregated impact is a small amount of my risk contingency budget, whereas I've got these 4 huge events here that crop up. And no one had those insights, did they?
You made me think of something else as well, like in terms of delegated authority to take a certain action under the contract. Quite often clients will put a financial limit to that. Arguably, that financial limit could increase perhaps if the quality of the ingredients going into that were better.
We did that.
We did do that
specific exercise from that data.
But I think
imagine
the data.
Imagine the questions that we don't yet know to ask of the data that we're starting to capture from site records.
The insights is when you start to bring different data sets together and take them off that triplicate pad that I keep referring to, and you can start to now understand how weather at certain times of the year affect productivity, and plan and use that data more proactively. We can achieve so many more meters per day in the summer as opposed to winter. Seems obvious, but when you start to overlay that together, you can use that to influence productivity, programs, and assessment of change as well. So I think, the big thing I've just taken from this section of this conversation is we're now making things proactive, not reactive. We're taking it out of that lever arch file, and we're actually doing something with that data every single day. Whether that be at home, whether that be on site, wherever we need to be, we can access that information.
The thing is, I quite like making spreadsheets.
Don't we all?
What am I going to do with my spreadsheet?
You can still have a spreadsheet.
Amateur interest. I have to make something else.
But you can still have your spreadsheet, haven't you? Because once you've got structured data, your spreadsheet will be even better, Ben. Do you know what I mean?
And actually, interestingly, although being a little bit flippant, it's true, because the other thing with digital is, and products which are multi-tenanted software as a service, is that the community then starts to innovate. So they'll then take your data and they'll do something else to it. And where it's useful to more than one person, that ends up being chucked in the roadmap. And then you end up with a fantastic report or analytics pack that you hadn't thought of before. And you get, the community kind of owns that. And then that best practice, maybe it becomes sector specific. Going back to what we said, well, why don't we prescribe the how a bit more? Well, that's the opposite argument, isn't it? Well, because the community start to think about the how, and there becomes pockets of good practice that are mapped to a particular nature of works or services that then, flourish into something really helpful, and it becomes more of a community. So there's all sorts of things. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with all my A4 triplicate carbon pads. So I'm not sure where they are.
On the wood burner.
That's good.
On the wood burner.
My final point on this really is how we bring the allocation of resource. They said labour, plant, materials, but I know that's not quite right. The allocation of resource, how do we bring that together to allow us to do all the good things we just talked about, allow us to better manage the contract, substantiate compensation events, assess things proactively? That seems like a missing step here.
Well, we need to make that an integral part of capturing the data, because it's traditionally been a separate thing, hasn't it?
Yes.
I'm the project engineer. I've written down what we plan to do and what we actually did. and then over here I'm capturing who was there and how long they worked on the triplicate pad or the equivalent into a spreadsheet, and we've not linked the two things together, so we're missing such a rich amount of this data that we can then ask questions of, that they need to be integrated and brought together.
Yeah, I'm aware.
My suggestion.
I'm aware Gather captures the planned as well as the actuals. Is that so? I guess what we wouldn't want is for the planned in Gather to be different from the resources identified in the program, for instance. That wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah.
So there needs to be lots of connections between the different management tools that we've got to our disposal.
And having that ecosystem of tools that talk together, contract management tools, planning tools, programming tools, resource management tools, and relating that back to your site record. All those things playing nicely together is how we get a better outcome for projects.
Yeah.
So that's where we need to head, I think.
Absolutely. And as many sort of connections with what's happening in reality can only be a good thing, right?
Okay, thank you for joining me today. Personally, I've got 3 key takeaways that I've learned from today's discussion. The way we capture records has changed, but how important they are is not. They are more important than ever. Digitalization has allowed us to do more with records, move away from reactive paper-based processes, and instead be proactive, use it for forecasting, understanding risk, and mitigating those risks to projects. Secondly, records are important. Having one source of the truth is vital to all these projects. Having a proper site records and projects as built on that foundation of trust that the NEC is famous for, allow us to better collaborate as clients and contractors and suppliers. And my third key point is that we should combine this data. We should link our site records with other systems, contract management tools, program tools. Doing that is an incredibly powerful offering. Allows us to use that data in ways that we've not even thought about before. Thank you for joining me today, Ben. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Pleasure.
Really enjoyed your insights into NEC. Thank you everyone for watching. Hopefully now understand how important shift records and site records are for NEC projects.